In the West, there are still a few good men left, men of God, like the circuit-riding preachers of old, proclaiming truth like the holy prophets of old, strong and bold. You're about to hear politically incorrect, but biblically correct truth from circuit-riding preacher Peter Peters, whose home base is a radio ranch nestled in the Laramie River Valley near Laramie, Wyoming. The radio ranch is a working cattle and horse ranch where circuit-riding preacher Peter Peters broadcasts nightly worldwide on the Scriptures for America Worldwide Broadcasting Network, reaching the world through satellite, radio, television, shortwave, and the World Wide Web. Writing for the brand, he preaches for the man, Jesus Christ, the Son of God. His circuit not only includes a radio ranch outreach in Wyoming, but also the LaPorte Church of Christ, located at the base of the colorful Colorado Rocky Mountains in LaPorte, Colorado, where he has preached for over 30 years. The message is preached there by Dr. Peters on Sunday morning or streamed live on the internet and are archived at the ministry website, scripturesforamerica.org. Dr. Peters' politically incorrect but biblically correct sermons are available on CD and DVD. Many in America, Canada, and all over the world are on the free CD and DVD ministry. Our address will be given at the end of this broadcast. And now, here is Dr. and Pastor Peter John Peters with the Word of God.
But I want to begin this message by talking about the word they again. Continually, you'll hear people talking about they. Now, this is just an exhibit that I brought to the pulpit. It's a flyer that a man has put out trying to raise money for a book that he's writing. And he's a good man, and I'm sure the book will be a good book. But I just highlighted in yellow a portion of what he said here. It says, quote, "What they're planning for us, sex, religion, politics, and money in the New World Order. Here are just a few of the chapter outlines. Which is more corrupt, the liberal media or the multinational corporations? Why truly big money wants your children to try drugs, even while they campaign to discourage these evils? How the brilliant scientists have come up with proven methods to destroy your family. All you have to do is let your guard down." End of quote. Now let's just analyze a few of the things that he's written here. What they are planning for us. Notice the word they. We use it all the time, do we not? What is more corrupt, the liberal media or the multinational corporations? Why truly big money wants your children to try drugs even while they fund campaigns? Now, we seem to understand intuitively. Maybe some understand and are afraid to even say it. But we seem to understand that they are out there. We call them the liberal media, multinational corporations. They this and they that. But seldom, if ever, will you ever hear a man use the word Jew. Right? You can be anti-anything you want on the face of this earth right now, it seems, but you dare not speak about this thing Jew. We can talk about the liberals in the media, but we can't talk about the Jews in the media. We can talk about the multinational bankers, but we can't talk about Jewish bankers. We can talk about they in these general terms, but you never hear the word Jew being mentioned. Deuteronomy 28:33 says, quote, "A people you do not know." We've used that passage in this series so far. It talks about a people you do not know will consume and eat up your labors. In fact, let's just turn there. Deuteronomy 28, verse 33. It says, quote, "A people whom you do not know shall eat up the produce of your ground and all your labors, And you shall never be anything but oppressed and crushed continually. End of quote. I want you to notice that it's a people you do not know. Now, the only thing our people seem to know about this term Jew is that they're poor, persecuted, innocent, helpless people. Always portrayed in the movies as such, always portrayed as what? Good. Now, Christians and Christian ministers, and certainly white males, are portrayed as quite often bad, 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 right? But the one thing we seem to know, which isn't necessarily so, is that they are these poor, innocent, helpless, persecuted people. The Scripture says, a people you do not know. Jack Moore wrote a book entitled, Christians Know Your Enemy. Now, who was persecuting who in the New Testament Scriptures? Were Christians persecuting Jews, or were Jews persecuting Christians? Which was it? Jews persecuting Christians. Now, you got to understand that we're living in a day and age right now that men like myself have to be somewhat careful about what they're saying, because we have such things as hate law. As I'll conclude in this message, I'll show you that we even have in the UN Charter now where men can be hauled into a world court and prosecuted for having, caused mental anguish to other people or another group of people because of what they say. So, I want to make it clear that what I'm saying so far is that what we see in Scripture, it was the Jew persecuting the Christian, not the Christian persecuting the Jew. But what is portrayed to us is something entirely different today, isn't it? Now, why do you think, Christian soldier, that the battle has changed any? That now all of a sudden we have nobody persecuting us, that everyone just loves sweet little Christians? Or why do you think that all of a sudden now it's the Christian persecuting the Jew? Why do you think that the hatred that those people had for Christ then has diminished any more today? It says, a people you do not know shall eat up the produce of your ground. In this message, I want to center it more in on some of their power. And it's certainly recognized that somebody has power in economics. In the last message, we discussed the Wisconsin cheese factories. Remember that? I can't tell you, or I shouldn't say it that way, it's quite remarkable how many people have told me how that same scenario has worked in other areas, such as the wool market, just being an example. I mean, if something works, you just keep using it over and over again, don't you? I've had people come up and explain to me how that has worked in certain areas of the business or industry that they're familiar with. I talked to a friend of mine last night on the telephone, an old Bible college buddy of mine, that one of the very few that has remained a friend in spite of the fact that he doesn't agree with what I teach and doesn't understand it, but he's still a good friend. And he was talking to me on the phone, and I said to him, I said, Morris, are you finding work down there? How's work going? And he's having a hard time. And this is what he said. When I hung up the phone, I wrote it down. He said, quote, you know what I think, Pete? They are eliminating the middle class. In 1982, we were the top paid people in the world. In 1992, we're about 13th in the world as Americans. Now, I don't know if his figures are right or not, but it's pretty close. But that's about what he said. But the point I want to make here is that he knew intuitively that they were out there, didn't he? He didn't know who they were. He just knew that they were trying to crush him and destroy him. The middle class, isn't that what it says here? And you shall never be anything but oppressed and crushed continually. Does the middle class feel squeezed and crushed, destroyed and plundered, and even recognizing that they are out to destroy them financially? We seem to know that in the economic realm, they are there. It's just that we're either afraid to say who they are, or we're afraid to, or we don't know. As another exhibit, I brought to the pulpit this book entitled The Score by Rudy Butch Stanko. Now, this book is sort of an underground book. Mr. Stanko sent this one to me. In fact, it's autographed, and I prize it. Mr. Stanko is a very, very brave man, tougher than a boot. He's a Nebraska Sandhill cowboy, not a Christian, and but his story goes something like this. He became a very successful meat packer. He was in the meat packing industry, and they had some packing plants. And I can remember back in about 1983, I think it was, maybe you remember locally, that all of a sudden Rudy Butch Stanko, his name was being mentioned on television, and the Cattle King Company was being mentioned, having put bad meat out to school children in the school lunch program, so forth and so on. How many remember that? Now, I'm sorry to say this, but at the time I thought, well, this guy's probably guilty. And I remember talking to a local farmer here who used to be a cattle buyer himself, and he said to me, I'll tell you something, that guy is not guilty. They're out to get him. I know him and his family, and he would never, ever do the things that they're talking about there. Well, he understood what was happening. The media was being used to help destroy him. Let me read from his book certain sections, and you'll understand. He said, in 1983, things were going well, and each plant, meaning his packing plants, had adequate management and continued to grow in volume and profits. Then on September 18, 1983, when I was on a Canadian fishing trip, the bomb fell. The Sunday afternoon NBC First Camera, a news program patterned after CBS's 60 Minutes, launched its premiere show supposedly to expose the inadequacies of the inspection service of the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA. Actually, it turned out to be an attack on Cattle King Beef Company. They accused Cattle King of unsanitary processing conditions, rat infestation, unfair labor practices, and other illegal operations. All of this information had been gathered and collated by an independent consumer safety agency, the Better Government Association, based in Chicago. However, the BGA was working for and financed by NBC, National Broadcasting Corporation. When I returned from Canada, I was amazed at what had taken place. Within 3 days, the Secretary of the USDA, John Block, had suspended Cattle King and Nebraska Beef from receiving any future government contracts and would embargo and condemn all the future meat production, 21 million pounds, purchased by the government. Further, my name, Cattle Kings, and Nebraska Beefs were plastered across every front page of every major newspaper in the country, again without any proof of the allegations. Not one allegation aired on the original show was ever proved. End of quote. Let's stop there a second. Now here's a man in the meatpacking business. He's not a Jew. He would be a goyim, as far as they're concerned. Becoming very successful. His plants are growing. And suddenly, within 3 days, there's a media blitz. And the government contract that he has is canceled. And he's amazed at all these allegations, which are never proved. But do you suppose they needed to be proved? Or do you suppose maybe the people already believed them? Broadcast across whose media? Going on, he says, false accusations from a media system assaulted my companies with no mercy. The press pictured the Cattle King Beef Company and the Nebraska beef packers and their owner, Rudy Butch Stanko, as outlaws comparable to J.R. Ewing on the infamous TV show Dallas. The outcome was a trial and my conviction. For many people, this would be the end of the story, but in my case, it is only the beginning. During the past 2 years, I have spent every waking moment realizing the power behind the force that is hidden from almost every mind that strives to progress and pursue the ultimate lifestyle in this world of opportunity. In this land of freedom, why should a government, in this case the Department of Agriculture, USDA, so quickly and totally cut off and punish a business and its owner who was its new main supplier and provided the bulk of the competition that previously was non-existent? Why would the press, which is supposedly the nation's and the world's bulwark and guardian against the enemies of truth, print so much falsehood? I had always known of the dominance of a group of people in our industry, but I had never been exposed to the historical facts nor the possibility of a controlled market and the reason for this lack of competition. Through its control of our money, the media, and the merchandise, this group of people has attained power and influence in every sector of our economy and at every level of our society. It is dedicated to the financial control of naive and brainwashed citizens of the world as a first step to enslaving them. Without financial freedom, there is no freedom. Whoever controls the issuance of money or credit controls you. Until I spent the time researching for this book, I was as suspicious but ignorant as most freedom-loving citizens of the world about this worldwide conspiracy. End of quote. Now, I just read sections of his book. In a paraphrase form, what happened here is, here's a man that was successful, that was making it well in the business world, and the bombshell came down on him, but they made a mistake, because this is one man that wasn't going to give up. And he went and started investigating, spent, as he said, every waking moment for 2 years studying this thing out, and guess who controls our meat market in this country? Jews. He shows it in the book. Guess who went to prison? Rudy did. Now, he's not a Christian. In fact, he's gotten hooked up, as far as I can see, with a non-Christian group. But one thing for sure is they were not able to break him. They had him in the hole more times than he was out of the hole. Isn't that right, Janice? I mean, this man's tough. He's been shot. He's been run through the diesel treatment mile after mile, day after day. They weren't able to break him. And he's out now, and he's mad. And he's doing what he can to awaken the world to what he called here in his book a worldwide conspiracy. But I use that as an illustration of an economic power in just one area. I have a tape, I'll just make reference to it here, called My Personal Experience with Jewish Powers. Is that on one or two tapes? That's on 2 tapes. Now, here I am, a preacher in Colorado, small community here, and I've been investigated by the Office of Inspector General, by the FBI, by the Colorado FBI. I have files on me. I have been before grand juries. Have I ever committed a crime? To my knowledge, I've never committed a crime. How did this happen? It happened back in, what was it, 84? When we started talking about this Jewish issue from this pulpit. And it was broadcasted across the headlines publicly. And we've discussed all that in my 2 tapes entitled My Personal Experience with Jewish Power. I know what he's talking about. I found it in a different realm, in the area of theology, in the area of the media. He found them there in the area of the meatpacking industry. Talking about the media, here's a pamphlet that we promote called Who Rules America? I want to read just a portion from it. Quote, the mass media form for us our image of the world and then tells us what to think about that image. Essentially, everything we know or think we know about events outside our own neighborhood or circle of acquaintances comes to us via our daily newspaper, weekly newspaper magazine, radio, or television. It is just not the heavy-handed suppression of certain news stories from our newspapers or the blatant propagandizing of such grossly pro-minority TV exaggerators as Roots and Holocaust, which characterize the opinion-manipulating techniques of the media masters. They exercise both subtlety and thoroughness in their management of both the news and the entertainment which they present to us. For example, the way in which the news is covered, which items are emphasized and which are played down, the reporter's choice of words, and the commentator's tone of voice, the choice of headline and illustration, all these things profoundly affect our attitudes. On top of this, of course, the analysis and the editors remove any remaining doubt from our mind as to just what we are to think about. They guide our thoughts and opinions so that we can be in tune with the in crowd, the beautiful people, the smart people. Virtually all national and international TV news in the U.S. is filmed, edited, and broadcasted by just 3 corporations: ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then he goes on to describe who it is that controls those media sources. What group of people? This system that they have used has been in use in this country for quite some time. Now, not only do they have control of what is a major media source today, television, but as you start checking back, guess who bought out the various publishing houses? What year was it, Milt, that National Geographic came out with an article about who are these people coming into America? Around 1920s. There was an article in National Geographic dealing with this influx of Jewish people coming into America. And the article was about who they are and what kind of mannerisms they have, and basically it was not a very complimentary article at all to the Jewish people who were coming into this country in hordes. Guess who owns National Geographic today? It's just that simple. Now, unfortunately, Christian people didn't seem to have the foresight to see what a valuable tool it would be to have control of the media in this country. A tool for truth and justice and Christ and righteousness. Now, why is it that we do not think that there are other people who do not have those same values that can recognize the assets of those media sources for other purposes? How about monetary purposes? Now, I brought to the pulpit this huge book here called Chronicle of America. It was given to me as a gift. It's been a very valuable gift to me because it has all the major headlines from each year in America. Going back through the different times in America, it goes year by year. I think it begins clear back in 1493, headlines that were being published in Europe. Goes on up here in the 1900s. I read about an article about the Republican McKinley retains presidency. But as I was going through here, in 1906, I noticed an article entitled Sinclair Exposes Meatpacking Jungle. Now, they didn't have television and radio then, but there was a lot of reading then. Let me read what this has to say. 1906 has a picture of the Jewish individual by the name of Upton Sinclair. Quote, "It's no easy feat keeping your appetite after reading select pages of The Jungle, a fictional glimpse of Chicago's meatpacking industry. Its 28-year-old author, Upton Sinclair, toured the city's stockyards as part of a team of investigators. What he saw has gripped and shocked the nation. At one point, Sinclair describes the remains of diseased cattle being processed into packaged food, along with bodies of workers who happened to fall into the mixing vats. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, the novelist wrote of these tragic men, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. This fact-based description has so outraged the public that an abashed Congress recently saved the Pure Food and Drug Bill from the edge of defeat. In addition, The Jungle has prompted a policy of federal meat inspection. Sinclair, a prolific writer with half a dozen novels under his belt, welcomes the acclaim for his new book. But he feels that the purpose of his novel has been misunderstood. His true target was not the unsanitary condition of the stockyards, he says, but the exploitation of immigrant laborers. As he commented after the passage in June by Congress of the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Acts, he said, "I aimed at the public's heart and by accident hit it in the stomach." In fact, The Jungle makes a direct plea for racial or radical reform, a point made in Jack London's fiery introduction, which applauds the author's proletarian sympathies. Even conservative readers have been moved by the plight of Sinclair's hero, Jurgis Rutkus, a wide-eyed immigrant from Lithuania who is abused by his bosses, built by con men, and mired in poverty. End the quote. I'll stop there. Now let's analyze what I read here. Isn't it just coincidental that this book came out and saved the Food Drug Act, the FDA? And isn't that a wonderful organization today? You know that the FDA just recently, I think it was in Oregon, raided a doctor's clinic, an MD's clinic, who was giving vitamin B vaccinations. How many have heard about that? They came in with a SWAT team, black hoods, guns, had the secretaries laying on the floor to stop this doctor from giving vitamin B shots. Guess who wanted the FDA? Guess who is withholding all manners of good things from you today so that the big drug corporations can prosper off of you? The FDA. And guess who was responsible for giving you the FDA? Jew Sinclair in his book, The Jungle. And guess what caused Congress all of a sudden to pass this and act? Guess who caused the USDA head to counsel 21 million pounds of Rudy Stanko's meat that was going to the school lunch program? Because the Jewish meat cartel down in Denver and other places found him to be too much competition. They used the media which they control that caused an individual in government to suddenly just stop everything. Isn't it the same scenario? The same thing has been going on and on. And guess who's always been talking about the exploited minority? And guess who the exploiter always is? Whitey. Well, I thought you'd find that interesting. I found it interesting. Who controls the media? Now, in our booklet entitled The Inadvertent Confession of a Jew, we quote a Jewish individual by the name of, let's see, what was his name? Aaron Zellman. He was a Jew who's formed an organization called Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. And listen to what he said in an interview. The question was asked him, Aaron, what can JPFO, that's his firearm organization, what can JPFO do to defend gun ownership that is not being done by other pro-gun groups? Aaron replies, Jim, it is obvious that one of the major problems we gun owners face is the heavy influence, some call it a stranglehold, of left-wing, liberal, Jewish anti-gunners in the media and the government, in the quote. My comment was here, notice his confession. Jews have a heavy influence, even a stranglehold in our media and government. Jews are left-wingers, liberals, and anti-gunners. I said many others have tried to warn Americans that Jews control our media and government, but have been ignored by a Pavlovian TV-conditioned populace. Now a Jew is giving the same warning. Will he also be ignored? To have a stranglehold is to have a death grip. If death grips are not broken, the victim dies. I simply bring it to the pulpit, though, to give you testimony by a Jewish individual himself that they control our media. And it seems that there's one hand helping the other hand continually. Think of this just came to my mind this morning as I went to the back doors there where it says exit here in the church. And I had to unlock the doors. You notice the door handles, they're the type you push and they open up. Well, it just came to my mind how that must have worked economically. Now you say, well, what's that got to do with what you're talking about here? Well, for years, this church had the same doors, but they had different door handles. How many remember that? Nice door handles, you just push it and walk out. And they worked quite well. Well, until one year, the fire chief comes along and inspects our building. Now, I know we probably shouldn't be allowing it, but for years they've come in and always checked the building. It happened before I started figuring out the system, and I've got enough fights, and I don't feel like fighting the fire chief, okay? so my enemies can condemn me for that. But anyway, I've let the fire chief in. They were just here last week, weren't they, Steve? Anything new? Oh, you left. Well, anyway, so for years our door handles were fine until one year they came in and said, oh, you've got to change those door handles. This is a fire hazard. You've got to have the type of door handle where you hit, push it, and go on out. And in order to continue to keep your doors open, well, rather than have the hassle, I think at that time Bud Treasurer took care of it and went ahead and went to see about ordering these door latches. Guess what? There's only a couple companies that have those door latches. It's just not something you go down and buy. And guess what? They're very expensive. Several $100s. And then it dawned on me this morning as I was unlatching that thing. I'll tell you how I bet the whole thing worked. Some Jewish boys got together and got the couple of companies that have those kind of door latches. Then they got to their Jewish buddies in the insurance business, which the fire chief works for. He doesn't know he works for them, but he works for the insurance company to make sure that everything is protected in these buildings so the insurance companies don't have to pay, you see. And the insurance companies then want to start requiring these things and do a study how much safer it is to have these type of doors rather than the other doors that we had. We lived safely with them for several years. Anyway, then can you not see it coming down, being passed through a legislative process or a bureaucratic process to where this is where the fire chiefs are told to start looking for these type of door latches on buildings that handle more than so many people. And imagine how many churches across the United States had to go out and buy those door handles in order to not have a hassle with a bureaucracy, not have to hire an attorney and fight the thing. It's cheaper to kind of give in. You know what I'm talking about? Now, how many millions, millions, and millions of dollars are we talking about? And they use our own people to enforce their industry. Anyway, I don't say that Pastor Peters documented that. That's just simply a theory. If you want something to do, I bet you could study that out and find that that's exactly the case. This is a book called Cry Brotherhood by Jack B. Tinney. I think I read it before, dealing with conspiracy. Let me read just a portion of it. In the introduction, he says, quote, talking about communism, it says, quote, its doctrines have been carried by Jewish immigrants into the crowded places of the diaspora where Jewish socialist bun branches nourished them and injected their virus into the bloodstream of other nations. And although world Jewry may be the means, compliant Gentile officialdom is the instrument. Jewish names dominate all others when subversive lists are compiled, but few will point it out for fear of being called anti-Semitic. Now this is an old book, and this man is deceased. Now I bring another book to the pulpit entitled The Enemy Within by Colonel Jack Moore. And I want to read to you from page 11 of the book. He says, quote, one of the best informed congressmen on communism and communist activities was Senator Jack Tinney, end of quote. Now that's the book, that's the man that just wrote this book I just read. Going on, it says, quote, for 12 years he was head of the Un-American Activities Committee in California. His findings formulated an investigation of Hollywood, where a young actor who was later to become president of the United States stood high in subversive circles. Then suddenly Tinney was smeared. One day, papers posing as right-wing opened up on him. Why? Because he asked forbidden questions about communism and the Anti-Defamation League of the Jewish B'nai B'rith. His curiosity became so great that he was willing to sacrifice his political career to get at the truth. He found the answer. But when he dared use the forbidden word Jew, all hell broke loose. He had the temerity to condemn the whole Jewish Zionist political setup, and the smear machine went into high gear. End of quote. Well, I bring this as an illustration just to show that the way the system works, there are kosher conservatives, and then there are non-kosher conservatives. You can have conservative talk shows, and they can talk about homeschooling and abortion, etc., etc., but there are certain things they never talk about. And by the way, you'll find time and time again that those men that are on those talk shows are Jewish themselves, and you don't even know it. One man that comes to my mind is, I was on his talk show years ago. What's the man that's with rock music? Bob Larson. Poses as a Christian minister against rock, and guess what he is? Jewish. Another one down in Texas. What's the name of that very famous, very large talk show host down there, very conservative in Texas? Anybody remember? Marlon Maddox. Guess what old Marlon boy is? Guess what? Marlon Maddox does not like conservatives like Pete Peters. Because why? There are certain things you don't talk about. And when you start addressing those things, then their media is turned and used against you. They have a great power in that area. Here's another area that they have power in that we never stop to think about. It's in the area of law enforcement. Now, this morning we had an interesting incident happen in Sunday school class. Those that were in Sunday school class can verify this, that this actually happened, did it not? A man came in to the Sunday school class. He's a retired policeman from the District of Columbia, and he gave me a Metropolitan Police District of Columbia shoulder patch. And he gave me my Metropolitan Police District of Columbia hat. Okay? And he said, I wanted to meet you. I heard your series of tapes on gun control. And he said, I'm a retired police officer. And he said, I heard you talk about in that series of tapes on gun control how you witnessed in Washington, D.C., something like, I forget how many cars it was. I think I said on there something like 10 cars chasing one drunk. But yet when there was gunfire outside of my hotel, nobody showed up. And he said, I laughed and laughed about that. And he's been on our tape ministry. And what we have there is a retired policeman. He's retired now, but he's basically one of us. He's come to see what we're saying is true. Well, stop and think of the power they have in the area of law enforcement. And here's how. Now, in our book, entitled America the Conquered, we have in chapter 7 an illustration of the Jewish power that's being used in America. Now, here is a picture of a group of law enforcement men that I took out of a newspaper article that someone sent me. And I want to read to you what it says. It says, seminar in Monessen. Law enforcement officers from local, county, and state departments recently attended a seminar at the Monessen Municipal Building. The seminar focused on ethnic intimidation and institutional vandalism and was put together by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Featured speaker was Howard Ross of the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith. Now I want to ask you something. Why is it that this Jewish organization, the ADL of the B'nai B'rith, can go around and hold seminars for our law enforcement agencies? Can you do it? Can I do it? No, we don't have that power, do we? But boy, the red carpet is opened up for them. And in this chapter, we have a newspaper article shows here, police officers study hate groups. And this article is about a Jewish individual by the name of Zussman, a woman, who came down and held a seminar, a closed-door seminar, if you will, for law enforcement agencies down in New Mexico dealing with hate groups. Guess who they consider a hate group? Well, in this story, it was Pastor Earl Jones, who has a newsletter that talks on the Jewish issue. Well, you'll find that these people, these Jewish people, are holding seminars, as we show in this chapter, across the country, and I'm one of the people they talk about, which I'm very honored. I'm very pleased about that. I mean, hold your applause. That's all right. You jealous people. Think about the honor it is to have an organized anti-Christ group going across the country informing police officers about you as a preacher. Now, isn't that an honor? Now, in this particular chapter, we show how we tried to get a similar forum with the law enforcement agencies, with conservative individuals from across America, not just the Christian identity movement, and show them about this Jewish issue. You think they'll give us a hearing? Not at all. Now, there's encouraging things that happen, and this is one that came across my desk this week, and I want to read it to you. It's a letter from a police officer. He's not retired. And he says in this letter, it's rather, you can see a rather long letter, but I'll just read a portion of it. He says, quote, "Before closing, I would like to tell you how I came to know of you. I think it was in March of 1990. I tuned into 870 AM New Orleans and caught the end of your broadcast in which you offered your pamphlet, A Just Look at Racism. I sent for it, but when I received it, I put it in my bookcase and forgot it. I lead a very busy schedule, extra jobs in the AM and work straight in evenings. In February of this year, I attended a hate crime seminar put on by the Southern Poverty Law Center and Klan Watch. During the day-long talk, you were mentioned and described as being the identity minister who was in the most demand. As soon as I got home that evening, I got out the material I had received 2 years before. I've been a follower of your ministry ever since. I wish you had daily broadcasts instead of weekly. How wonderfully ironic it is that the great Morris Dees, in an attempt to discredit you, actually recruited another follower for you. Every tape, newsletter, and booklet that I've received from you has been shared with others." End of quote. Isn't that encouraging? Now, Morris Dees is a Jewish lawyer who goes around and tries to prosecute men for speaking things that he doesn't agree with. And but again, the point is think of the power that this man has to be able to go and have a session with law enforcement agencies. Wouldn't you love that opportunity? Do you think that I could get before them and talk to them about the Christian plan for the world, so forth and so on? Not at all. They have this power, but no one talks about it. Listen to some of their quotes. I brought a few to the pulpit. This one comes from a Yiddish newspaper called The Day. It's out of New York. The quote comes from April 6, 1936. Their own words, quote, "The Jews of America, because of their numbers, interest, and ability, constitute a great political force. They have not usurped this power. It belongs to them by right. They are going to exercise it as they see it. What are you going to do about it?" End of quote. This one comes from a book called Warren von Zion, page 27. The author is Moritz Cohen, and he says, quote, "We no longer need to close ourselves up in the medieval ghettos, since we have for some time possessed the dominion which was promised to us. Without us, no potent in the world can understand or undertake anything, for we control the gold market. No word contrary to our taste is published, because we control the press. No idea which displeases us permeates the intellectual world, because we dominate the theaters. The Hebrew spirit can conquer the world." End of quote. Let me give you another illustration to back this one up. Notice he says, no thought gets to the people except we want them to have it. And I've talked in the earlier messages in this series about how parasitical it becomes, this invasion of the enemies of Christ. Well, the example that I have in mind, I think I've shared it before from this pulpit, but I've never put it out on the tape ministry, is that several weeks back, we tried to advertise our booklet concerning the death penalty for homosexuality in several newspapers locally. We tried the Collegian, which is a newspaper there at Colorado State University. And guess who I had to deal with? A little Jewist who was the editor. Guess who would not allow us to advertise that booklet in their paper? Although their paper allows naked people to stand boldly in that paper. Isn't that true, Teresa? They allow lesbians kissing each other, pictures of them in that paper. And they talk about being, liberal and open-minded. But they wouldn't allow this. So I had to deal with a little Jewish editor. I said, oh, who do you answer to? And it was some board. But they had some individual had me go see. So Steve was with me. We went to see this individual. And it turns out that the school cannot tell the paper what it can and cannot print. Those on the school facilities. Here, you talk about a parasite taking over the host, and now the host has no control. And the board has control of the paper. Well, how do you get on the board? I said, that was a lousy paper when I was here in the 60s, and it's far worse now. Well, the board elects itself. In other words, when any new person coming on the board, they elect that person, whoever's going off. I said, what a cozy liberal setup. But you talk about a closed-door parasitical thing where the tail begins to wag the head, or wag the dog. There you have it. I tried to get that particular book in the Triangle Review. Guess who is the publisher of Triangle Review? A Jewish individual. Guess who wouldn't allow that to be published in the Triangle Review? I tried to get it in the Colorado one. I will say I got it in the Colorado one, but I could not use the word penalty. I could not use the word death. Well, the title of the booklet is Death Penalty for Homosexuals, right? And so they took anything out that had to do with death or penalty. What else was it, Steve? Can you remember? But I give the illustration to back up what this Jewish man said when he says, no idea which displeases us penetrates the intellectual world because we dominate the theaters. It says no word contrary to our taste is published because we control the press. That's power, isn't it? Here's another quote. This comes from Century Magazine, February 1928. Listen, quote, you make much noise and fury about undue Jewish influence in your theaters and movie places. But what is that compared to our staggering influence in your church schools, your laws and your government, and the very thoughts you think every day? You have not begun to appreciate the real depth of our guilt. We are intruders. We are subverters. We have taken your natural world, your ideals, your destiny, and played havoc with them. We have been at the bottom, not merely of the Great War, but of nearly all of your wars, not only of the Russian, but of every other major revolution in your history. We have brought discord and confusion and frustration into your personal and public life. We are still doing it, and the end is still a long way off. We still dominate you. End of quote. That's by Marcus Eli Ravage in Century Magazine, February issue 1928. Interesting quote, don't you think? A Dr. Benjamin Friedman, who was Jewish, wrote in 1947 concerning modern Jewry the following, quote, but America and American Christianity stand at a crossroad. The majority must decide whether it will longer submit to being the tool of a small but ruthless and unscrupulous minority of a minority people. End of quote. This one comes from the January 30th, 1976 International Jewish News by Nat Rosenberg of the Denver Allied Jewish Federation. He wrote, quote, proportionately, we have more power than any other comparable group, far beyond our numbers. The reason is that we are probably the most organized minority in the world. End of quote. I'm still talking about the power they have. This one comes from Benjamin Disraeli. He was a famed Jewish statesman, Prime Minister of England. He published a novel in 1844 entitled Coningsby, in which he wrote, quote, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are behind the scenes. End of quote. Here's another one, Felix Frankfurter, The Jewish attorney for the framers of the Federal Reserve Act and a Supreme Court justice made a similar statement, quote, "The real rulers in Washington are invisible and exercise power from behind the scenes," end of quote. On February 23, 1954, Senator William Jenner warned in a speech, quote, "Outwardly we have a constitutional government. We have operating within our government and political system another body representing another form of government," end of quote. Here's an issue of the Spotlight dated May 4th, 1992. It says, UN PAC puts you at risk. Quote, "The Senate, with little debate and no recorded vote, and while the controlled media look the other way, has ratified a treaty permitting UN thought police to enter this country and charge you with a crime if your words are perceived to be politically incorrect." Goes on to show that they did this by a voice vote on April 2nd. Says, quote, "But the establishment media conducted a virtual blackout of the legislation and carried no reports of its passage. This is in contrast to the publicity surrounding the passage of the Genocide Convention in 1986. The Genocide Convention empowered an international tribunal to declare American citizens guilty of genocide and punish them if someone perceives their words as causing mental harm to a particular race or ethnic group or a member of such a group." And here's that article from that genocide treaty. It says, any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law." In the quote. I don't have time to go further into it. I don't want to bore you with it, but here's the bottom line of it. They have such power that today you can be guilty of a crime for speaking words that causes them mental harm. Now, where does that put people in a position like mine? Rather serious, isn't it? Is it any wonder that people aren't speaking out on these things? Notice that even in this message that I've given you mostly evidence from their own words or from others who observed them. President Bush, in an address to the nation not too long back, in that address he said, "And we have got to stop anti-Semitism." Now think of the power that this group has when they can get the President of the United States to specifically sing out protection for one particular group. Do you think he'd ever get up and say, "We have got to stop this anti-Christian mentality that's going on in our land. We have got to stop persecuting the white Christian males in this country"? You ever hear him say that? No, not at all. Why? Because power belongs to them at the present time. In closing, let's close with some scripture. First, let's turn to Daniel chapter 11. Verse 33. It's always been this way. It says, quote, "And those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword and by flame, by captivity and by plunder for many days." End quote. Only God knows how many men have bravely, through the passages of time, spoke out against such evil forces, and as a result they've either been put to death, or they've been incarcerated, or they've been plundered, their property taken from them. Isn't that exactly what it's saying here? Turn over to Psalms 94, verse 16. It says, quote, "Who will stand up for me against evildoers? Who will take his stand for me against those who do wickedness? If the Lord had not been my help, my soul would have dwelt in the abode of silence." End of quote. Notice he says, "As for me, I'd have just kept my mouth shut, except the Lord had been my help." Turn to Philippians chapter 1. Notice with me verse 28. It says, quote, "In no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God." Our opponents know that when you no longer fear them, it is a sign of destruction for them. Lastly, let's turn to Matthew chapter 10. There will be those who criticize a message like this, wondering why you don't give something that's more spiritual, more upbeat perhaps, once you have more scripture, and so on. So I read Matthew 10, starting with verse 24. It says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master." Let's stop there. Did our teacher, Jesus Christ, in Matthew 23, condemn, expose, and rebuke the Pharisees? Have we not already shown in this series that the Phariseeism of Christ's day is Judaism of this day? So it says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master." It is enough for the disciple that he become as his teacher, and the slave as his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household? Let's stop there. If they accuse our master, our teacher, Jesus Christ, of being mentally unstable, crazy, is it any wonder they would do the same today and add to that hate monger, neo-Nazi, racist, radical, extremist? It's no wonder. A servant is not above his master. And it says in verse 26, "Therefore, do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known." And that's very encouraging to me, because brothers and sisters, I really sense that we are on the eve of a great awakening. That all the things that have been covered up and they've been able to get by with for so long, according to this verse 26, is going to be exposed. And there might be people today that's afraid to associate with you because you're willing to expose it. But I'll tell you what, someday they're going to wish they knew you, because everybody's going to be on to this thing. Amen? You know, righteousness will prevail. We must not fear them. The victory is ours. Christ has told us they're the ones that should be in fear. I have a responsibility at times just to make known these deeds of darkness, to expose it in light. And may God bless this message to that end. And may He hasten the day that it will not be just a handful of people here and there that understand this, but awakening of the populace and our enemy exposed and more. Amen. Let's stand. We'll close in prayer.
The preceding message by circuit riding preacher Peter Peters from the LaPorte Church of Christ, located at the base of the beautiful Colorado Rocky Mountains in LaPorte, Colorado, has been aired on the Scripture for America Worldwide Broadcasting Network and is available on CD or DVD and is archived at the website scripturesforamerica.org. Remember, circuit rider, preacher, and teacher Peter Peters broadcasts live nightly from his Wyoming radio ranch, nestled in the Laramie, Wyoming River Valley. It's a working horse and cattle ranch where circuit riding preacher Dr. Peters reaches the lost sheep of the house of Israel worldwide on satellite, internet, and shortwave radio. Dial settings 5755 and 9480. Check out the 24-hour, 7 days a week web broadcasting website sfawbn.com. Scriptures for America Worldwide Broadcasting Network is made possible by the prayers and tithes of the faithful. If you want to write to circuit riding preacher Peter Peters, the address is Scriptures for America, P.O. Box 766, LaPorte, Colorado 80535. Or you can visit us on the web at www.scripturesforamerica.org. The preacher will be riding back this way next week. and hopes you will too.
Now, Christians will talk about them being Christian soldiers. You only need soldiers if you have what? Enemies. A war, a battle, a conflict. It's not just for parade services, as I've said before, that the Christian uniform is to be worn. Christians do not understand their enemy. They do not even know who their enemy is.